Hey, everybody, this is Alex Merced, and welcome to my economics podcast. It's been a while since I've recorded an episode, but some interesting things going on in the world. Um, Probably the most interesting thing in the world to me is that Milei was elected president of Argentina. I know this happened probably like a couple weeks ago now, um, and a lot of people have been talking about it. I always like to kind of like let things sit and muster and kind of like form my opinions on them and then think about what is worthwhile saying. So I just want to talk more about the practicality and the case for dollarizing Argentina. Okay, so like, what is the situation in Argentina? So basically, in Argentina, you have a situation where you have really bad inflation. I think it's like what 150% inflation. I've heard the number being, or plus that. So that's pretty bad inflation. Okay, I mean, people here in the U.S. are pretty up in arms over like 7-8% inflation in the last several years. So basically, inflation is a high priority, which makes sense that they would elect someone who, now, granted, I have been associated with sort of like as with some of the more, as a libertarian, to believe in a lot of very very sort of what are not mainstream economic ideas. So when I say that Millet is an extreme candidate, it's not out of me denying that I share a lot of the same economic opinions as Millet. I do. Okay, I'm very free market. I'm very, libertarian. I don't know if we necessarily line up all the time when it comes to social issues, but um, you know, he wasn't elected. I mean, it was clearly he was elected for on the issue of inflation, and on that, I do share a lot of the concerns because I've talked about in previous episodes like what drives inflation. So in the sense that it comes down to, it's very simple. It's just a simple like, are there too many dollars chasing too few goods? So if there's a lot of a currency and much stuff that you can buy with it, basically the prices are going to be more. Okay, and again, it gets more complicated. There's the velocity of money. So you know, if people are buying stuff with it and they're buying stuff with it regularly and they're spending it, that's going to drive prices up even higher. So it's how much money there is, it's how much goods there are. So if you take a look at I forget what the name of the equation is, but the MV equals PQ, which is money times velocity. So like the amount of money times the amount of times that money is spent, aka the velocity, so how many times that money is turned over, equals the market price of all goods, PQ, which is the price of all goods and the quantity of all goods. Okay, so bottom line is like, if you took the price of everything that was bought, aka GDP, and that should equal the amount of money times the amount of time that money was spent. Okay, so basically, if you had $1,000,000 and that turned over 5 times, okay, that would be like $5,000,000, and that should be the aggregate price of all the goods that were purchased. Which, when you really think about it, that's just kind of inherently true. Like, it's just like pointing out, I think the word is a tautology. It's like, it's just logically true. Cool. So bottom line is like, when governments spend a lot of money, when they drive huge deficits, those deficits have to be financed. And that can be financed externally by people buying bonds of the government. But there comes a point where there's only so many people who can lend money to anybody. So when you start borrowing too much of the borrowable funds, the price of those borrowable funds become higher. That's what's referred to as interest rates. So interest rates get pushed up because the government's borrowing more. The only way to kind of prevent that from happening is to make the amount of money available to lend the government more. Okay, so assuming the government borrows in their own currency, in this case the Argentines borrowing in the Argentinian currency, there has to be a central bank that controls the money supply that then makes the money available by literally increasing the money supply for the government to keep borrowing. Okay, so bottom line is it's a rush. It's basic government's outsized role in the borrowable funds market that creates this need for central banks to intervene to meet their monetary policy goals. Okay, they may not be thinking, oh, I'm trying to facilitate government borrowing. They may be thinking as like, hey, I need to facilitate my interest rate target, but the result is the same. Okay, if my interest rate target's 3% and government borrowing is going to push that interest rate up to 5-6% because they're borrowing so much, well, I'm going to still end up pumping liquidity or money into the economy to get back down to 3%. Okay, so essentially that government borrowing pushes money into existence. Okay, So that's essentially, and again, there's an element by which private banks do this too. Private banks can borrow money, and this can put pressure on interest rates. This could put pressure on reserve requirements and things like that. That puts pressure on central banks to then act and increase the money supply. So, you take a look at people like Hyman Minsky who focused on sort of like that nature of it, where basically it's not always the central banks deciding, oh, we're going to do this because this is what makes sense, our policy strategy, but they have a goals, and then they're responding to these external choices being made, whether it's government borrowing, private sector borrowing, and saying, okay, well, if they're going to spend all this money, that kind of messes with my goals and basically forces the central bank to act. Okay, so basically how other actors might sometimes push the central bank to sort of act, or whether you take a look at other Austrian economists and basically how they view central banks. All of that kind of messes in with that same story of just sort of like it tends to kind of land in inflation when you basically have a lot of debt accumulating. Okay. So essentially that's what's going on. Okay, so if Argentina's government's borrowing more money and whatnot, and they don't want the interest rates to get out of control, which would cause the interest rate service or the cost of that debt to explode, making things even worse, then you're going to end up having inflation, because you're going to end up having to use liquidity to bring those rates down, which creates this liquidity in the economy that's going to lead to more velocity of that money. Or, well, not necessarily more velocity. It could. Again, it depends on what's going on in the economy. But it can turn into inflation. Again, two things need to happen. The money has to exist, so there has to be the quantity, and then there has to be the velocity of money. So the first step is you make the money available. The second step is people decide to spend it. So you can't control how people want to spend money directly. You can't sit there. You can. You shouldn't. So typically the lever that you have is the quantity. Okay, basically if there's $1 million, you can spend money X number of times, and if it's $500,000, you can spend money a less number of times. So, you take the prices can adjust, but again, prices don't just adjust in anticipation of the change in the money supply. Prices change because prices would go down in response to the frictions of the money supply's disequilibrium with the current price level. So, the friction has to happen first. So essentially, that's what's kind of going on in like Argentina. You have this inflation, you have this friction that comes from inflation, where prices just keep going up because the amount of money is going up faster. So again, things are always relative. So it's kind of like when I talk about like Bitcoin, people are like, oh, whenever U.S. is never going to adopt Bitcoin. Yeah, probably people in the U.S. right now are relative to the financial systems that they have available to them, the stability of the U.S. dollar relative to most other units and mediums of exchange. There's no reason for someone in the U.S. to suddenly switch over to Bitcoin as their medium of exchange, unless they're doing it on more ideological grounds. Okay, like many crypto libertarians, including myself in the past. But it doesn't necessarily mean that's always true. You could be someone in a third world country or in a country that's falling apart, where suddenly like something like Bitcoin is relatively more stable and has relatively better infrastructure than what you have available to you where you are located. And in that case, there's places in the world where Bitcoin makes a lot of sense, and there's practical usages of Bitcoin. In the same sense that as someone in the U.S., I take a look at like U.S. monetary policy, and I might look at it with like a lot of judgment and skepticism or whatnot for a variety of reasons. But that's relative to my context. Like if you're looking at many other countries in the world that have much more unstable currencies, much more issues with inflation, and less sound central banks, okay, they might look at U.S. central banking and be like, okay, hey, this is better than we can do here at home. And that's sort of like the impetus with like Milei and the dollarization of Argentina. So he wants to basically take the ability to control the issuance of currency by Argentina by dollarizing. Now, exactly how he plans on dollarizing, I don't know. I don't know if it's an actual like usage of the dollar as the currency. Okay, which generally the criticism I hear is like there's just Argentina doesn't have the money to buy enough U.S. dollars to make that swap. Okay, there's different ways you could do it. So now that's kind of where I want to talk about for a moment. Just kind of talk about like how you could possibly make that swap, like different approaches you could take. You could still issue a new currency, but the new currency then has an explicit like relationship to the dollar. So this is what other countries have done, where they do a peg. Okay, technically a peg is in a sense market manipulation, because what you're doing is you're basically, the central bank then acts as a market maker of the currency relative to another currency. Okay, now I mean most central banks do act as a market maker, and a market maker is someone who buys and sells all the time. But usually central banks act as a market maker for their debt, for the government's debt relative to the to the currency that they manage. So the Fed is a market maker for U.S. Treasuries and the U.S. dollar relative to each other. Okay, most of the time, I mean, they have bought other securities in, like when you take a look at 2008 and things like that. So I mean, the part that it's gotten wackier, but theoretically, that's typically the case. So in this case, the central bank would be acting as a market maker between currencies. So essentially, they would need to have a reserve, not just of their own currency, but a reserve of dollars, because they would have to have, but it might not be as much as you need for an outright swap of currencies. So you could sit there and say, hey, this new currency is always going to have a relationship of, let's say, one peso equals 25 cents. Okay. So then you would have to first have a reserve of dollars that would allow people who want to trade in. So that way in the markets, there's always someone who's willing to at least sell pesos for 25 cents US dollars and would be willing to pay 25 cents US dollars for that. So you would need a certain amount of US dollar reserves to be able to make sure that you can keep that bid and offer open, because that's how you maintain that peg. Okay, and then theoretically, when the price becomes higher, so when people start outbidding you, okay, you begin selling off some of your reserves, and vice versa. You just keep buying and selling to keep that number sort of where it's at. That would probably be the most likely scenario. That's probably, I imagine, what Milei has in mind. Now, another way you could do it is, you could use a basket of assets. Okay, so instead of having necessarily several dollars, I mean, interest rates have gone up. So theoretically, you could buy a bunch of treasury debt at a discount somewhere out there. It would be discounted, basically debt that was issued back in like 2008 and 2009 when interest rates were zero, probably heavily discounted with rates where they're at right now. I don't know how much, but you could basically buy a bunch of bonds that would mature. So you're basically buying dollars at a discount. So it might be $1,000 bond with minimal interest, but you're paying like $800 for it. So you can increase your amount of reserves over the long run by buying these discounted bonds. Okay, that could be an approach. Again, you still wouldn't be able to dollarize Argentina overnight, but you might be able to accumulate. You might be able to take the reserves you currently have and expand them over time, and you could even issue currency back by those treasury notes that you bought at a discount. Okay, and then basically it would just basically be that, hey, there's this holding of treasuries that back these dollars. Yeah, and then you would just have to kind of come up with some sort of way where you can track, basically create sort of a non-explicit tie that each currency represents a claim over the principal, and then basically as those mature, continuing to buy sort of discounted U.S. treasuries to keep accumulating those reserves. And again, if they're not redeemable dollar notes, they're just backed by the quantity. So the idea is that there is this pot of gold that backs it. It should still probably have value. I mean, but basically, eventually you'd want to convert it to be redeemable. But I mean, you could say, hey, these become redeemable 50 years from now. And then if you have clear auditing of the underlying assets, and a clear detailing of sort of like when the liquidity is expected, you could probably build enough faith to make that kind of transition. But it would require faith. The other way you could do it is you could issue, debts in the new currency that are used to help finance building reserves. There's different ways. There's different financing schemes you could do to make that switch possible. But again, it doesn't matter how well thought out any switch will be, there would be a recession afterwards. Bottom line, it's just it's a disruption, and disruptions are going to generally cause economic hiccups. Like you take a look at U.S. history, and whenever there's monetary disruptions, whether they were good or bad ideas, there was always some sort of like hiccup, because basically the economy has to recalibrate to the new normal, and that requires all sorts of existing contracts and arrangements to fall apart and re-tinker. That doesn't necessarily mean it was a bad policy or a bad thing. There's just going to be that those frictions, and again, I mean, they are bad things for people who were on the wrong ends of those existing arrangements. Okay, and they're gonna be like, oh yeah, this was the worst thing that ever happened. This negatively affected my life. My business fell apart, or something like that. But it doesn't mean in the long run you don't create a more stable economic underpinning. So I do think like exploring some of the ways they could do this. I don't know, even if they mix different types of they created, they mixed a couple of different types of assets, not just US dollars, but maybe, the currencies of a few different countries, or a basket of different things. And then, I mean, an idea I've always jogged around is like having sort of a dual currency, where you have sort of like a savings currency. So you would have that currency that's backed by the dollar, but that's typically more of a savings type thing. And then you have your normal sort of fiat currency that's more of your sort of spending currency. And the idea being that the savings currency is just basically exists as, they're both legal tender. They can both be used to pay taxes. But the idea is that generally probably people aren't going to circulate the savings currency because it is more sound. Generally people rather spend the money is likely to be more inflated. But the idea is having these dual currencies with these dual structures allow people to come up with sort of novel compensation packages where you might get paid, a portion of your income in the stable currency and the more stable currency, and then portion of your income in the spending currency. And that becomes sort of like the mode of day-to-day transaction. And then the other one becomes sort of your fallback, when how the offers the economy some flexibility when inflationary periods appear. Okay. There would still be a demand for, like, again, that flexible currency, but it also, again, allows people to plan a little bit differently and provides a little bit of diversification in monetary instruments. And I do advocate for a free market in money, but I think a dual currency could be sort of like this in-between solution where basically you have you let people choose. And again, they don't have to choose one or the other. They can balance out their assets because there is a demand for that sort of, there are benefits to having sort of that more elastic a currency, but there's the effect that it has on savings. So there's also there's a lot of benefits to having a savings, more stable currency that you can save in versus a more elastic currency that can be used more for like speculation and investment. Hopefully the elastic currency gets managed better, but as long as you have the savings currency, then people aren't necessarily like completely left in the lurch when there's something. So these are just thoughts, but I think there's a couple different ways that sort of dollarization could be achieved. So hopefully you guys enjoyed that. My name is Alex Merced. You've listened to my economics podcast where I once in a blue moon talk about economics. I'll see y'all later. Have a great day.